when I said I was gonna do some game code programming bullshit. I lied. Or changed my mind. Same shit.
Sit and spin, Dick. Where do you get off having that much bad boy attitude? Oh, this guy doesn't play by anyone's rules.
You don't get a bad boy or something?
I'm thinking I'm a bad little boy. Resident Evil 6 is such a dead horse at this point that I've been using the very idea of reviewing it as a joke on this channel. But there's a different side to the story worth covering, since the game's reputation has evolved over time in a way that's not frequently seen. At launch, most critics regarded it as a colossal failure, with major outlets giving it scores as low as 3 out of 10. 3 out of 5 would have been considered low for a game in this series. One of the common complaints was that the game was a pathetic attempt to cash in on the success of military shooters, with Capcom abandoning horror in pursuit of Call of Duty-like sales goals. Along with that, the controls and mechanics were derided as clumsy and broken, the monotonous action sequences were tiresome, the camera was frustrating, the QuickTime events were fucking everything. Everything about the game was terrible. Sales momentum dropped sharply
I
after launch,
don't have
and
any
Capcom
money to
rebooted
go
the series
sailing.
with a much more focused and horror-based vision that has served them well ever since. It would be easy to write the game off as an embarrassing miscalculation, but then it would be hard to explain how the game has kept selling over the years, taking the number 3 spot in the rankings. That's not the number 3 spot in the Resident Evil series, that's number 3 in Capcom's entire history, and it's just a sliver away from being number 2. Granted, a lot of those sales came after the game landed in the bargain bin, but it still counts for something that Resident Evil 6 just refuses to die. The game's fans will claim that it continues selling because it was an extremely fun action game with groundbreaking third-person controls and combat mechanics that were misunderstood by the majority of critics. Their argument is usually that Resident Evil 6 should be approached like a Platinum title, a stylish, over-the-top action game like Vanquish or Bayonetta, and that the haters rejected it simply because they were too closed-minded to accept anything that wasn't survival horror. So who is right? As the internet's most unbiased nobody, I feel as if it's my reluctant duty to answer this question once and for all, beginning with the most important point. The controls work really well. Nothing is more fundamental to enjoying Resident Evil 6 than understanding its mechanics, and this is one area where Capcom has to be blamed for failing to communicate this to players. Playing Resident Evil 4 for the first time, I was able to pick up the controller and dive right in without a hitch in spite of the game's radically different perspective. That's partly because the PS2 controls were almost identical to the older titles, but also because Resident Evil 4 was such an intuitive and straightforward game. In comparison, Resident Evil 6 feels like it has too many buttons doing too many things, with combinations of buttons doing other things. It's not a game you can just jump straight into with good results. Usually, games with complicated controls have a tutorial to walk you through everything you need to know. Resident Evil 6 technically has one, but it wastes its time trying to impress you with explosions and slow-moving quick-time events. Considering the percentage of gameplay taken up by those things, maybe that decision actually makes sense. Capcom explained it by saying that they wanted something cool at the start of the game. And what better summary of Resident Evil 6 could there be than that the developers didn't bother teaching you to play because they thought an explosion would be cooler. An explosion you'll see later in the game anyway, and that they copied and pasted here because they wanted you to see it twice. But if you take the time to practice each move on your own and build up the muscle memory, there's an incredible amount of mobility at your disposal. You can duck or roll in any direction to avoid attacks, and even when you're on the ground, you can continue evading. You can power slide with guns blazing in reverse direction to continue shooting up the enemy's back. I actually can't wait for an enemy to throw something or take a swing, since flopping around is so much fun on the face of it. That mobility ties into the new melee system. In past games, you were mainly shooting and could occasionally open up a chance to melee when hitting certain spots. Resident Evil 6 still requires stunning to perform the most powerful attacks, but you're free to punch and kick whenever as long as you have stamina. Pressing aim and fire at the same time will let you do a powerful quick shot, which stuns the enemy right away and sets them up for easy follow-up attacks. One of the common complaints when the game came out, the one that I shared, was that ammo was far too
irony.
It felt like a sick joke to turn the series into an action shooter then deny you the ability to shoot. But if you actually use the new melee system, that problem goes away. Sometimes. More on that later. The game also has a lot of great context-sensitive animations for the attacks, depending on your position relative to the enemy and the environment. Anytime someone defends Resident Evil 6, they inevitably share a bunch of clips or gifs of wrestling moves to prove that the game is great. And the action is really flashy and slick. It's clear that Capcom spent a lot of time getting the core mechanics to feel great, and it's unfortunate that so many people couldn't appreciate it. So does that mean the critics really were closed-minded and that Resident Evil 6 was a misunderstood masterpiece? No. The big problem with that argument is that Resident Evil 4 exists. This is the game that gave you ammo when killing enemies, and gold and other trinkets that could be traded for bigger, better guns. The old games were all about avoiding the use of resources at all costs. This game was all about expending. It introduced quick-time events and coverage.
Useless.
It sped up the pace by ditching puzzles and turning the world into a linear rail so that you could blast through enemies and gather jewels more efficiently. It was a total betrayal of everything survival horror was about. So if fans really are so closed-minded about change, why is it that this game is almost universally revered as a masterpiece? What did Resident Evil 6 do in comparison that was a bridge too far? Letting you roll on the ground? Listening to most of the arguments in favor of the game, you get the sense that its fans would be fine with everything taking place in one big room, with zombies funneled in for you to endlessly roundhouse kick. And that's kind of what the Mercenaries mode is. This is probably Resident Evil 6 at its best, with a focus purely on its combat. But a full game needs a lot more than that. There's gotta be connective tissue holding it all together. The reason Resident Evil 4 got away with what it did is that it was nearly perfect all the way through. The opening segment is so fun that it's hard to resist starting another playthrough, and afterwards, the creepy farm slows things down and pulls you in to explore. Then there's another big action section, followed by more atmospheric silence. The game knew just when to change gears to keep the player interested. That pacing is such a major part of why the game works. The slow, quiet moments are every bit as important to the game as the action sequences, and without them, the action would lose its relative intensity and become boring. Resident Evil 6 completely and utterly fails in this regard, mainly because its slow segments are terrible. Jake's campaign has a chapter where you search a mountain for 3 digital MacGuffins.
Gotta find that.
Stringing these things across a large mountain feels like the most uninspired kind of busywork a game can throw at you, as if the developers needed to fill 15 minutes of time and couldn't come up with anything better. The few things they tried to make it more interesting only made it worse and worse to play. It's already hard to see and the snowstorm whites out your vision randomly. There's a giant icy slope with snipers, machine gunners, and snowmobilers charging down it, and if you get hit or do any of your fancy moves, you'll slide all the way down to the giant cliff at the bottom. This is video game hell. And Resident Evil 6 is full of segments like this. Ada has to search an aircraft carrier for, say it with me, 3 who gives a shits. Running through dull, copied and pasted barracks, scavenging for ammo to fight waves of identical enemies, using mechanics that lost their appeal 2 campaigns ago. When you finally find a key, a monster eats it and disappears through a vent, adding this junk segment out even more. At times, it feels like a high-voltage software game. It looks, sounds, and plays like something made by a much smaller studio with fewer resources. There's no particular mood to most of it. The past games were incredibly good at setting a tone for each area. This game's idea of atmosphere is putting a couple of mannequins in a dark room. And that's it. Okay, I guess we're done with that. There's an awkwardly long car ride that I assume is supposed to feel tragic, but after the thousands of zombie heads you've suplexed off during the multiple outbreaks in this game alone, it's kind of hard to feel much of anything at this point. The soundtrack is full of generic military themes.
Alpha Team, get out of there now!
Stuff that sounds ripped off from other sources. This is also a matter of taste, but the visual style looks like someone severely crushed the blacks and blew out everything bright with bloom. It's the game equivalent of doing this. Resident Evil Remake is a great example of dark visuals done really well. The lighting and the objects within it are given special attention, and even the dark areas have a lot of carefully placed detail to soak in. Even the objects that are prominently lit in Resident Evil 6 look like junk, and there's a sense that the darkness is hiding how little there is to see otherwise. And the game has a lot to hide, considering that getting close to practically anything will reveal GameCube-level assets. The only thing that consistently looks nice is the character work. Wait a minute. This lady gets around. Resident Evil 5 may not have had enough atmosphere, but it was at least an amazing-looking game for its time, and it still holds up fairly well. Resident Evil 6 feels like a step down, and at least on PC it literally was, with a few effects being downgraded. It's clearly a game where you're supposed to be charging forward without ever stopping to look around. Wait a minute. That guy gets around. The obvious reason for the rushed visuals is that Capcom was stretched thin developing 4 scenarios at once, something that turned out to be much harder than they were expecting. And that's all Resident Evil 5's fault. You can pinpoint the exact moment Resident Evil died as a horror series, and it's right here. When zombies with AK-47s started tactically ducking behind cover and firing back, the series had finally completely stamped out the last trace of horror. If you can replace the monsters in your game with normal humans and it doesn't make any difference, you've kind of fucked up at making a horror game. The near universal response to Resident Evil 5 was that it was still really solid fun, but that the series had veered too far into action and needed to tilt back towards horror. The problem is that Resident Evil 5 went on to become the best-selling game in the series, and even the best-selling game in Capcom's history until Monster Hunter displaced it. There was no way Capcom was going to walk away from sales like that, but they also didn't want to lose long-time fans, and that dilemma seems to be the origin of the split campaigns. Chris's scenario feels like the one they wanted to make. It picks up right where the zombies with guns idea left off and amps up the military shooter vibe. Leon's was meant to be the one for horror fans. The idea of having one scenario for each isn't necessarily terrible. The problem is that Leon's campaign is hardly less action-focused than any of the others. It's just as full of explosions, quick-time events, and diving around with guns blazing. Everything that was supposed to make this the horror scenario was just superficial nostalgia. You've got Leon, the star of Resident Evil 2, using his Resident Evil 2 gun, an old creaky building in the midst of a zombie breakout. But the zombies fly through the air like Cirque du Soleil performers, and there are only a few brief instances where it's even remotely scary. The game has the absolute balls to put you in a classic Resident Evil location with locked doors and then force you to watch someone else open them.
I kinda wanna learn how to edit values. I really don't like the design of Blood Return.
Slowly walk 10 minutes following your 5th grade math teacher around.
Then you have a move like Dark Ether, which is meant to be useful for conserving TP. And then you have Blood Return, which gives you TP with literally no consequence. I want these to cost a lot of TP along with the self-damage. Maybe being higher to make up for the fact that Ascetic Deeds is a freaking prerequisite ability anyways to begin with for this thing. Reduce the amount of TP restored, increase the self-damage, or maybe keep it as it is, and increase the TP cost. So at least, even if everyone else is benefiting and recovering TP, Vale would still be suffering. It would still be an actual Blood Return. In the base game, Blood Return simply healed, restored HP to Vale whenever when someone else died. Which, yeah, that is a very disappointing ability. But it wasn't game-breakingly overpowered, and there were some benefits to having it. It was a well-designed ability.
Just needs you to put some help buttons. It's critics thought that Leon's game is the best. Probably it's the only one that has any real semblance of atmosphere, but it's the worst in terms of utilizing the game's mechanics. I didn't like Chris's scenario at launch, but revisiting it now with a better grasp on the controls, I actually found it to be the best. Mainly because it has the highest concentration of actual gameplay versus scripted events. But as it drags on, it fails to change the pace and the action starts to get boring and frustrating. Java mutating with shot is an interesting mechanic, but the entire game is basically reliant on the Resident Evil 4 things up the simpler department. The first Parasite appearing only once you got a few chapters in.
You know, freaking Ether Charge would even synergize really well. Yeah, freaking Stargazers, or Zodiacs rather, synergize really well with monks. In this mod, it's kind of absurd.
Like this one, for slightly touching the edge of the dog causes him to die. This motherfucker can't swim.
mean, I guess it really is only a problem if you're over-leveled. Blood return is a bit of a reward. But otherwise, it is a bit of a waste of a turn, I suppose. That's its downside. When you use Blood Return, your monk isn't really doing much contribution. The TP restoration is very valuable, but ultimately meaningless compared to using something like an Amrita, which gives way more. I still really don't like it. So again, I'm limiting it to once per foe fight.
The game is filled with these boss fights for 4 years. Life is being kept run down along like ammo just to continue participating in someone else's boss fight. When you run out of that, well, it doesn't really seem bad, because it's also it's bullshit. And it's enjoying this games. You have to like stupid, pointless, exploding action movie bullshit.
Yeah, I like everything this mod changes except for Blood Return. Seriously.
Action movie one-liners. No. Oh, God. And you have to be impressed by handling segments and seeing much
It's this guy.
the scary. If you bought a flying simulator like this, you would ask for your money back. But it's in a Resident Evil game, you don't expect it, so that means it's good, right? You better have endless appetite for this stuff, because there are 4 whole campaigns in it to get to. The big twist of Jake's campaign is a stalker, and it first seems like a potential throwback to Nemesis from the third game. Fortunately, it turns out to be nothing but a quick-time event generator, and Jake's campaign with more of this garbage gameplay than it's true. By the time you get to Ada, the scenario was originally a secret and is even less polished as a result. It feels like everything wrong with the other scenarios has culminated into its own campaign. Any fun derived from the controls should have dissolved by now, even those mechanics I praised had problems. The game often melees the wrong targets or uses the wrong object for cover. Cases like this register the wrong functions. The peripheral mechanics around those 4 controls are mostly terrible. It was simple to kill the old survival horror. Then Resident Evil 5 upped the tension with a real-time inventory, which was arranged in a grid. Each item was a single press away. Resident Evil 6 puts everything in the real-time menu, even the camera and graphics settings, which makes no sense. No one is looking for aim inverted auto-roll. The inventory is arranged in a straight row, which is the least efficient layout possible and requires scrolling every item to get to the one. You'll have to do this.
They get their special.
Somehow manages to leave you empty on ammo, full on inventory most of the time. Using an herb
Drop.
requires mixing herbs together, mixing those herbs together, putting them in a carrying case, and then tapping the heal button to eat it like Tic Tacs. The system is so clumsy that you're likely to all over again, damage you take while healing the first time. Revelations was a step away from the action of Resident Evil 5, and it simplified the healing process to just one button. Again, that was a more horror-oriented. So why is it the fast-paced, over-the-top action game has the most deliberate, clumsy healing in the series? What's the point? Bayonetta doesn't make you enter button combos to use a lollipop. Fans of the game defend stuff like this by saying that you can mix herbs in between melee animations, but that you can use a hidden method to mix them automatically by holding a certain button combination. It's still a bad system, but more important, why is the fast mixing hidden at all, as if it were the Konami? There's a similar trick where you can hold the action button to avoid the painfully long recovery times from getting knocked to the ground. If you're lucky, you might see the game flash tips like this on the loading screen. The game shouldn't have such frustrating mechanics in the first place, but it definitely shouldn't vary the right ways to do things in places most players will never find them. Resident Evil 4 made its gameplay much more addicting by letting you upgrade your guns with really satisfying results. Resident Evil 6, and another apparent nod to online shooters, replaces this with a system. Most of the perks have no obvious result. There are 2 devoted to stabilizing aim, and even with both, I barely see a difference. The only ones worthwhile, the other one, explicitly defined it's like 5 extra stamina bars. Once you've found them, there's no use bothering with the rest. You can only equip a few, and most of them don't really do anything, so what's the point? The series lost a lot of potential replay value by ditching its own great upgrade system in favor of poorly copying someone else's. At this point, the horse has been beaten into a gelatinous pulp, and I have to stop. The fair answer is that the game's somewhere in between both extremes, as the Buddha taught us. It's not the complete loss that many people made it out to be at launch, and it does deserve more credit for the things it did well, mainly when it comes to moping. It is, in small doses, a lot of fun. But the game Capcom built around those controls is bad, and no amount of getting good, learning to play the right one, changes the fact that the pacing is terrible and that the scenarios are badly lacking polish. In order to argue that this game is good, you have to sweep an incredible amount of garbage on it. If you could edit games like a film and stitch only the good parts together, you might be able to make a really good game out of this. But the half-baked game we got failed as a vehicle for its own mechanics. You can still have fun playing it, but it sucks. In a way, everyone is right about it at once. That's just the kind of game Resident Evil 6 is, a partially enjoyable failure. If anyone wants to argue that it was unconditionally great, then you've got to submit evidence of yourself enjoying these bullshit sequences. I want to see you having fun fetch questing for these keys, or climbing these ladders, or staring in genuine awe at the game's 400th explosion. Post your evidence with the hashtag #PatMorganExtreme
Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. And the best part is I am playing in the hardest available difficulty right now. And apparently, as long as you overgrind, everything's still pretty easy. I was basically this level, if not higher, when I was playing the base Etrian Odyssey 3 on normal difficulty. And it was still quite a challenge. And more importantly, a little fun. I mean, I won't deny this is still fun, but...
That you have to go there. There's a high school girl who has a crush to die. In her pursuit. School, but it was girls who have a crush on him and annihilate them before they witness sparks. This sort of doubles as a sandbox type of high school. The concept of rival is tied into the game's win, not being the game favorite of all time. As such, the game can only until the time rivals are added, and after 10 years, this game has won. To understand just how long this development. Anyone who was 9 years old when the game first started has now graduated high school. After 10 years, the key features of the game that were expected to be developed just aren't there. Just laughable, but also abhorrent, because he was taking a lot of people's Patreon money to develop this game. He may not have been able to contribute much in the way of rivals and efficient code, but he certainly did contribute his fair share of deranged messages to fans that made Satan look like a hero.
Oh, yeah! What the?
Though Yandere Simulator has become one of the leading faces of failed games, it actually had an incredibly successful start that Yandere Dev, or Alex, managed to throw away. Now the story of this may not have been one that he wanted. It's not a story of some indie game developer being inspiration to others. Instead, his actions be a case study of how to disappoint. And there are so many valuable lessons one can take away from analyzing the situation. And today, we're going to look at all the ways Yandere Dev failed, and how all of this shows the importance of personal accountability, discipline, setting reasonable expectations, and of course, not being egotistical, creepy, or deplorable to others. With the creepiness, I mean, his live streams alone are enough to make anyone sleep.
Stream is offline. No one can see. It's time to do. I always do this time.
Yandere Dev is less suited to be a game developer, and would probably be better off being a sleep paralysis demon that just sort of lurks at the edge of your bed and makes weird noises at random times. And in the process of making this video, I feared for my sleep, for what I was seeing was keeping me up at night. But luckily, Manta Sleep, today's beloved sponsor, swooped in and saved the day. Manta Sleep makes tons of products that aim to and optimize your quality of sleep, so you have the energy to create your best life. And in my experience, they've succeeded. See, they sent me one of their sleep masks, and it has now become one of my sacred, prized possessions. I started using it when I go to bed every night, and I find that it helps me sleep way better. See, it has these little eye cups that block out light. The mask is incredibly adjustable, and you can take the eye cups off around, change the angle too. You can also resize the fit of the mask using a simple strap. So, even if you have a comically tiny or comically large Megamind head, this thing will still work for you. Even when I was rolling around in the night and I started sleeping in like the Peter Griffin death, this thing still remained comfortable and did. The mask has this premium quality feel to it, and it's silky smooth. It's super comfortable. All in all, I really love the sleep mask, and it's helped me get some quality sleep at times when I really need it. So, if you're interested in any of this, you can check out Manta Sleep using my link in the description. And use code SEMANTICS for 10% off. Thank you, Manta Sleep, for sponsoring this video. Now it's time to get back to the tragic subject of Yandere Dev and Yandere's. So let's begin examining this disaster by looking at the start of this game's success and how he was already planting the seeds of disappointment. The state of Yandere Simulator's beginning is one that any indie developer practically begs for. It started development in March of 2014, and just over a year later, in the summer of 2015, it was gaining serious traction with people such as Markiplier and DeFi playing it. People all over the platform were giving this game millions and millions. And this was also at a time when indie games were growing more and more successful because of their coverage on YouTube. However, unlike these games, it became clear that Yandere Dev did not know how to manage this level of success or turn it into something. He made a lot of mistakes that successful game developers just generally don't do. One thing he did was he wanted to tell everybody exactly where he was at with developing the game. He provided frequent updates across social media where the game was and what he was working on at any given time. While this certainly started off as a good thing, this very clearly became a problem when time passed and he failed to actually follow through on what he said he was going to do. Let's take a look at the current Yandere Simulator website. It's public right now, and it appears that the About tab hasn't been updated since probably before August of 2020. I mean, this is truly a sight to behold. The About tab on the website is an FAQ. One of the questions is, when's the game's release date? And here he said that when he finished implementing Osana, the first rival, he would hold a crowdfunding campaign, and then based on the results of this campaign, that would determine the game's release date. Now, it's 2024, Osana has been released, and there was no crowdfunding campaign. While he's had donations from fans who are expecting certain things to come from the game, he has not released an official campaign. In the answer, he says what he would do if he did not reach his crowdfunding goal, and by having no campaign, that automatically is going to mean he did not reach his crowdfunding goal. So, Let's see what date he gave. If the crowdfunding campaign cannot meet its bare minimum goal, Yandere Simulator will have to be completed without professional assistance. I will be very limited in what I can do, so the production values will be low, and every rival will feel like a clone of Osana. Final game will feel nearly identical to the current debug sandbox, and it will most likely be released sometime in early 2021. I might have overshot that by a bit, considering it's 2024 and there's one rival out of 10 for the game to be considered. And he's listed other dates too based on how the crowdfunding has gone, and there's nothing listed here that's any later than the year 2022. Now I know I've said that there's only one rival, and that was for simplicity's sake. Actually, the matter is kind of complicated. For nearly the entire time the game has been in development, Yandere Dev has been known to get distracted with the side features of the game. Constantly adding small things to it had no real impact on the actual core gameplay itself. By far, the most interesting, convoluted distraction of his was 1980. He basically made a separate game mode in Yandere Simulator that has 10 rivals, but it's not part of the main story. No one really was waiting for this mode to come out. Like, this is not what was promised for years. People have wanted the main story to get rivals, and he just randomly got distracted with like a side game that he just stuck in the main game instead of working on the main thing people wanted. He has gone so far off track with the original vision of the game, and has basically taken every side quest he could think of. People have a right to be frustrated, and it's gotten to the point where people have felt like he's dragging things on longer because he wants more money. And honestly, I do think that the reason this game has gone on as long as it has is because of the concern for relevancy more than it is for the concern of money. He's even stated himself that it's important for Yandere Simulator to receive constant ongoing development, or else it risks losing relevancy.
The game is only alive for as long as people are interested in it. People lose interest in the game, it's dead. If I release frequent updates, people will remain interested in the game.
His concern for how relevant the game is, and by extent himself, is a huge factor for why this game is still not finished. See, the funny thing about Yandere Dev is that I think he likes playing Dev Simulator more than he actually likes working on the game. He could point to all sorts of instances as the single point of no return that do this game, but I think the most catastrophic thing he did for the future of this game was when right at the start he decided to put himself, the developer, at the front and center of the game's marketing. He was the developer, but he made himself inseparable from the game's image by putting himself everywhere all over his YouTube channel and being so overly open online. He set both himself and his game up for this disastrous
Dang it.
cycle, where his reputation had the ability to tank his game, and his poor performance on the game could tank his reputation. If he's an off-putting individual, people don't want to play the game, and if he keeps delaying development while taking people's money, then people start seeing him as more of an off-putting individual. I think it's time to talk about how poorly he managed his online presence. First of all, it's integral to understand dislikes sent towards Yandere Dev not just come from pure frustration that people weren't mad at him just because he wasn't coding fast enough. It's because various instances of him being creepy came to light. 35 and was in his mid-20s when he started working on the game, and he has implemented some incredibly questionable features in his game that just aren't right. The game stars high school students, and he has spent a very strange amount of time on various parts of these girls' outfits.
This seems weird. Is this necessary to the game? Is this pertinent information from my everyday life?
And he's been exposed for talking to his fans in a way that no one should ever do. It's a large piece of the story for why he has acquired so much of the pieces of the game. And then when you combine all of this into the fact that it became increasingly clear he wasn't working on the game as much as he was telling people, it's pretty easy to see why his reputation declined so heavily. And he has very consistently shown not know how to take criticism. It got to the point where his Discord server became a meme. People were doing genuine get banned from Yandere Simulator Discord speedruns. But his inability to take criticism is not the biggest sin of communication he's committed. The biggest problem with how he's communicated on the internet is how he's talked to his own audience and group of supporters. There are multiple examples over the history of Yandere Dev's YouTube channel and blog in which he talks about the game like he is being held captive as a developer, like he is being locked up somewhere forced to make this game. Years ago, he posted 2 videos, What's Taking So Long Part 1 and Part 2. And here he talks about the problems that he thinks are impacting his productivity. And this whole video is absolutely ridiculous. In it, he starts to really set the tone that Yandere Simulator has completely consumed his life. Voices how he feels obligated to spend 12 hours a day on the game, make sure it's being developed at a rate where people won't lose interest in it.
This is why I work on Yandere Simulator 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and don't take any vacations. I'm worried about people losing interest in the game. Worried about losing subscribers. Worried about losing my patrons. Worried about being told lazy. Worried about being
Yikes.
game.
That was a little too fast. I overestimated them.
Now,
Also, oh my god, I remember watching that video. It's so funny now.
It's popular, less productive, so busy responding that he's not working.
I'm releasing cool updates. The game's popular. Lots of people are playing, which results in me not having very much time to code.
Saying a game being popular, less productive, demonstrates a failure, and just for it. Listen, for reaching out to his best, doesn't respond to anything. He made it seem like an unchanged fact. He had to reply to every single person that you contacted him. Limit the project. Practically doesn't reply, and to reach out makes the game development slower. He actually directly stated in a blog post from October 2015 discussed how answering emails slowing the speed of Yandere. Instead of taking it on himself to just stop answering, just he puts the blame on his fans, told him to stop sending, I quote, stupid. Here are his direct words. Please always remember, I receive literally hundreds of emails every day, and that every hour I spend with these emails is an hour I am not. And I'm not working on the game. Game's development is not moving forward. However, in other words, to write a stupid email, waste my time, are literally delaying the game. Later on, he writes, remember, every time you waste my time by writing an utterly stupid email, a Yandere girl, this for a second time. I think that was his attempt at it, but the statement comes across as rigid. He didn't just say stupid email, he said utter stupid. Yeah, yikes, that's, can't hide the anger there. This really is quite odd to me because their inability to help solve the problem. Being a popular game you okay, and respond to getting tiring because of time consuming. Doing it A, acknowledge that this is what happens in this public. Learn the everything. Only answer certain questions. What or reading every email you get. Tell your younger fans reaching out to you. Stop sending stuff that is utterly stupid. Option A, something entirely in control. And option B, something that provides action support. Also installs them, but do not just take a step back, stop answering them. Getting hundreds of emails a day. Clearly can't manage that. And this email statement, it wasn't just left with one. It decided to make a 2-part about how emails are ruining productivity. So let's take a look at these because these videos actually did create backlash for him and have since been removed from the channel. Because he wants to be a game developer that responds to his audience.
I want to be interacts with his audience. Just think, I took the time to write me, so I've been responding every single
It's a fair goal, but you don't need to reply to everything he considers active. And then when he brings up emails wasting his time, he says that once he spent 9 days answering
9 days spent answering emails.
the sad classical music in the background and the picture he has up for most of the video all come together to create the beautiful, poetic statement, woe is me. It feels awful, even though he says otherwise.
Asking pity. Just want you to understand something. Because I work on the game 12 hours a day, without taking days off. No time. My hobbies.
I'm getting secondhand embarrassment.
Watched anime. Barely any time
There is no purpose in these creative decisions unless you're trying to evoke sadness and get people to result. Later on in the video, as a character providing potential solutions to his email problems, then he shuts down. The point is to sort of basically raise the questions the audience is already going to ask him, that way he can say no to them in the video before anybody else wants to do. One potential solution that comes up is the idea of hiring a secretary to answer emails. So that way people can be responded to, but he doesn't have to take his time away from the game, and immediately nukes this idea off the face of the earth, saying the first reason why he doesn't want to do it because he doesn't want to have to babysit the secretary. Maybe just is generally using unprofessional terminology because he doesn't want the secretary to be lazy and work slowly.
I don't want to babysit the secretary for several months until they have experience to do the job. I don't want to risk the secretary filtering my emails incorrectly, failing to send me emails. I don't want to risk the secretary lazy through emails so slowly that they're on myself.
Now first of all, you can put master code on a typewriter and he'd work faster than Yandere does. He could be the secretary and shit would get done faster. Secondly, just went straight for the jugular on this hypothetical secretary, saying she's gonna be lazy, she's gonna just suck, and she needs to be babysat.
Why are you using she pronouns specifically?
Or really non-half empty. Glass shattered on the floor. In this video, he really ramps up one of the condescension audience. He tells people to stop even trying to give him ideas in the rudest way possible.
I have a suggestion for you. Don't email me. Tell me that 99% of the time, somebody suggests a feature.
Ah yes, nothing like telling your supporters the ideas they're eager to share are probably stupid and worthless. As previously mentioned in this video, he brings up potential solutions fans will give him and shuts them all down. And he gets really mad at the idea that people are gonna try to help him fix this problem.
Stop. Just stop. Whatever you're about to ask, whatever you're about to suggest, whatever solution will help you, I already hear it 100 times a day. Already decided something.
Make a long video to your fans saying, "Woe is me. I'm struggling here because it's hard to make a game for you guys. I am held hostage answering emails." They are, of course, going to reply back with their suggestions on how you fix your problem. It's a natural and common response to hearing someone vent their problems. Telling someone to stop, and that whatever they're going to say has already been heard a hundred times, is a statement that demeans individual concerns and makes them feel bothersome. Not only did he blame slow development on his fans reaching out to him, he also has acted like the support the game has gotten is a prison. In What's Taking So Long Part 2, he acts like he's being held captive and says that if he stopped working on the Yandere simulator as much, he could take his life back.
Downgrading very simply to just be a hobby, so that I can take my life back. I would finally be able to play video games and watch anime again.
And in a video, What's Going On with Yandere Simulator's development, said the reason that the his game sucked was because he felt like he had 3 visions pointed at his head. He visually edits YouTube, Patreon, and this person turning into ones pointing at his head.
So I was writing as if I had once pointed at my head. I wanted to shout out as quick as possible.
YouTube logo represents Patreon being people who are donating to him on Patreon, and I believe this is for dissatisfied followers. Not only is it a statement that really shifts blame away from himself and places it on his audience again, he edited Patreon supporters to a gun pointed at his head. This is how he feels first, as some demanding pressure forcing him to in no world I'd be remotely making a joke as funny as this dude suggesting that people giving him money are actually holding him hostage. These videos were years ago, but they were posted at such a crucial point in time for the popularity and development of this game. I will link in to the current state of things. has his condescending attitude towards good chunk of his own viewers, a large part in driving him, turning scrutiny towards him, making fake people happy, and driving the sale to the ground. And now it's time to talk about Yandere Dev's biggest mistake that tanks the potential of its game. It's absolutely abhorrent score counts and inefficient time management. And again, we're here on this video, 2024, Yandere Simulator has 1 out of 10 rivals and has only completed stage 4 out of 8 on the developmental road. Despite his many statements that came earlier, such as when he said it was 2021 or 2022, it isn't here. I mean, clearly, yes, we've established to get to this point, the man has poor time management, but I think it really needs to be managed. How?
This
Why?
kinda makes me wanna work again. Maybe I'll do it after. I just wanna play for 2 hours at least.
The game's still good. Now, we've already established that we've wasted a lot of time.
Then I'll spend the rest of the night programming out of spite, out of this anger I'm feeling right now.
And instead focus on application. Generally, the work you should make. Realize that you should create outlines, get the larger areas done first. Build on top of that. Something functional. You decide to start adding in extra features. However, he actually disagrees with this argument. He thinks the process of Yandere Simulator is an efficient and even good way of working because he views this game as a puzzle.
Like Yandere Simulator, like that. It doesn't matter what order the puzzle pieces are. It matters is that eventually all of the puzzle pieces are. It's true that it's easier to focus on puzzle. Let's create all the pieces first. That's exactly why I decided to prioritize or it's like guidance counselor or prioritize also.
The puzzle analogy is an interesting one. Almost makes this argument sound convincing, yet it's still for justification. 10 years later, when you have only the edge pieces, the center of the puzzle is empty, any observer is going to walk by, unsure what the puzzle is even about. They can't see the clear picture. Careful making progress that you can see. The puzzle process is not a good idea. Now to highlight an absolutely ridiculous example of this convoluted process right in it. In October 2014, way before he was even close to having the first rival be properly developed, already spending his time thinking about making DLC and DLC rivals to implement. Another way on
Why?
spend his time like garbage is coding the game, but he has no intention of using the final product. This awful coding makes the game performance long been the problem. Because of that, he's gotten a little defensive. He's tried suggesting that the criticisms against his code are garbage because the code he used in the game didn't mean anything anyway. The game was a B slice, and as a result, it's forcing the reading of the product such a of finally how.
Fucking
Supposed
bullshit.
to allow you to experience every feature of the proposed game. So in the process of finishing the slice, I will essentially be programming the feature the game needs and developing the first rival. A lot of code and assets will be placeholder.
Then he gave himself a dysfunctional base to build code off of, and it's taken a while to fix.
It's difficult to make adjustments or add new features to the game at this point in time, because I have to untangle the cycle every time I want to change something.
Despite this acknowledgement that it was a poor decision and lost time, he still gets mad at others for calling it out. Because he's gotten distracted on really small side details, and he's put code in this game that would matter later on, his priorities have been terrible. Poor prioritization wasn't just a problem with the complex comparison, it's also something that seeped into all areas of his life. According to his own words, he was satisfied with how long Yandere has developed, saying that looking back on his late 20s, he didn't feel hollow because of how much it made him live his life.
Seriously, I'm not finished until the president. I'm what, over 30 years old. That happens. I'm going to look back on things. I'm just going to see a giant hole. They have it. Suffering and very simple. It's ridiculous, so I try not to do.
And he said that he couldn't even attend weddings in his life. He just couldn't take a break from making the game.
I've been asking you but things always decline.
Very sad, very tragic, but of course, he could take many breaks, stream, for ungodly amounts of time, which is something he does to this day. He still wastes his time streaming a lot. Really break this down. The music choice being sad, no uses, combined with the fact
Why am I even watching this?
are why this game takes so long, and that his late 20s are complete garbage because of how long he has to work on this. Message he's sending in, you should feel guilty. I am sacrificing everything for this project. It's pretty pathetic because he very clearly didn't have free time in his life, and his poor time management is entirely his responsibility. In his video, What's Taking So Long, he includes 2 graphs to describe what impacts his productivity, how he divides his time. It shows the exact percentage breakdown, how much time he spends. Literally 60% of it is used for communicating with people in some shape or form, whether that be sending out updates on videos or directly talking to people involved in the project. Only 20% is reserved for adding. This means that 80% of his time working on Yandere Simulator, not actually coding. And he said that when problems come up in his real life that take him away from game development, the 20% time loss. So he has to take that 20% out of this graph somewhere, and you guys are never gonna guess where he took the 20% from. Can you guess where he took the 20% from? Take a guess. That's correct! Yandere Dev had to deal with IRL stuff. He stuck his 20% time loss right in that 20% chunk of adding new features.
Pop up. I spend time on school spending.
Decides to halt all code-related progress, instead of just using communication to 6% in each category. I prioritize communication and making videos for the game, instead of actually making videos, and the only reason people want to communicate or watch your videos is for the progress and completion of the game. It doesn't make sense. There are tons of easy solutions that can take it and just focus on the game more, if he held himself accountable and acknowledged that his process was dysfunctional. It begs the question, did he actually want to develop, or did he want to be a game developer? His priority was to finish
Well,
game
I suppose this isn't too
right?
bad.
Or was he interested in actually being a game developer to follow and show interest in? I mean, what other conclusion are people supposed to reach after 10 years when the game is in such a poorly developed state? Either he is completely incompetent with a gold medalist in mental gymnastics, or maybe his real priority of these past few years haven't been the game at all, and instead, there's one true priority to all of his actions, which is just a matter of how relevant each person is, how much people like him. Years, people have been saying that Yandere Dev doesn't care about his game, and that he cares about one true thing, money. And lots of people have been arguing that the main reason he won't hurry up and finish the game is because he's hammered and wants to use detail, which I mean, to say, he certainly is receiving ongoing payment, but the game not being. So there is a motive there, but I really think that money is not the main reason why he's progress of this game so much. He knows that once the game is done, people stop. It is not entirely about money, but rather personal relevancy. And I almost think that Yandere Dev wanted to be a streamer or content creator instead of someone who games. Videos on his channel titled Yandere Dev are about Yandere Simulator, yes, but even in a lot of these, what's the focus? Features of the game and complications of coding, or the problems plaguing the developer's life? He has enough time for working on things related to Yandere Simulator. Over 50% of it is dedicated to outside the game or interactive. Only a small chunk of it is actual hands-on game development. He has wasted countless hours streaming. He used to waste countless hours streaming, and he said the game is his top priority. In those words, he has expressed the concern he had about Yandere's saying that the game needs development. That is why he's constant updates.
The game is only alive as long as people are interested. People lose interest in the game instead. If I release frequent updates, people will remain interested in the game. If I release updates slowly, people will lose interest in the game.
If updates is slow, it's no good. And if the game is done, it's no good. Also, he said that he himself does not want to be God.
All of my fans will hate me. Someone else was developing a very deep game to place of my game. I would be free. And the work I've done over the last few years will
He doesn't make this a secret. This is all about how people see him and his own personal relevancy. Yandere Simulator exploded in popularity. It's clear he wanted to turn the newfound attention on his game towards himself. But now he has to cling to his game as a lifeline for his own relevancy in his world. where relevancy is currency, is terrified of going broke, and the safest thing he can do is ride out dying leftovers of this game, because all other attempts to build a name for himself have failed. He needed a reason to pay attention to him, and when you've made a game that people care about, it will tune into your progress on it, and whatever you say on the matter. So the longer you can keep that going, more people pay attention to you. So it's never been about the game. It's always been about him. Bring it back to the present, again, there is 1 out of 10 rivals in the game. Yet there's tons of other side games no one asks for. It's sure the game will never be done. It still has poor timing, and based on recent information that surfaced, it is now the lead apology at the start of the part. Its creepiness has reached the point of no return. You won't ever be able to gather enough public support again for proper crowdfunding and actually get this thing done. And it would be tricky for someone else to beat this game out, given the awful legacy it has attached to it. He wanted nothing more from it, and through his completely harsh condescending comments, horrible behavior, most view him as a dishonest, creepy, harsh individual to be avoided. Wish of not being forgotten is granted to it. The internet won't ever forget the efforts of young people. People won't forget the problematic behavior, the failure of this project, and the memes that came out of it. But what does it mean to remember? Not be forgotten. Is it to remember on people this? Or is it to be remembered in a way that you wish to? Behavior over time highlighted very few positives, and the things that will last in people's memories are the actions he's done. With the passage of time, minor details about who he is, what he likes, minor personality traits, background, but only the really dark staying in the public. Is this what it means to be remembered? And if it is, better off than being forgotten. One thing is certain, this game has no future, but it was interesting to watch all of the development. And it showed that if given enough time and money, if you're stubborn, or time management, your project will go nowhere. And of course, it's taught all of us that it's probably not a good idea to support creepy game developers with a history of degenerate behavior. But yeah, thanks for sticking around at this point in the video. If you like what you see, you can always like and subscribe. And if you want another way to support the content, I do have channel memberships. Join and access the perks. And if you want to see the stuff I do outside this channel, I also have social media and a second channel. Thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your day.
Well, that was the thing to watch. I have no idea why I did that. Fuck. That is actually a common occurrence on the Switch when I'm trying to draw my map. Like I tried to put on a marker, but I end up drawing something instead. It's pretty frustrating. How are you still alive? I sometimes feel like listening to Etrian Odyssey 1's music. There's just a very specific song I want to listen to, but who knows, maybe I'll listen to everything else. Let's see if I can find the game's OST.
Various controllers from Nintendo, PlayStation, and Xbox. I always thought it was weird that they're all functionally identical. Same amount of buttons, similar ergonomics, they do the same thing. Yet the button layouts are all different. Just the X button on the front is in a different place on all three major consoles. Oh, sorry, it's cross on PlayStation, but you get what I mean. I think it's strange that you can find a ton of history videos and books diving into all the other specifics of each piece of hardware. What processors the consoles used, who invented each major feature. The button layouts are something that almost nobody talks about. Where did they come from? Why those buttons in that order specifically? Surely these layouts have a long history behind them. Some sort of evolution like the controllers we have today. So I thought it would be fun to take a look at that history and try to piece it all together. Should be a quick, easy video. Very simple. Nothing to get into too much detail. Just a quick, easy video. So the entire history of video game controllers goes something like this. Wait, hold on. Before we continue the video, I should probably eat something first. I don't know about you, but I've been trying to cook more recently. Ordering out is too expensive.
Or maybe rather than healing everyone, what if Blood Return just recovered one person's TP?
Surprisingly low price delivered right to your door. Big good food a priority this year. Choose from HelloFresh's.
Of course, that would still give Vale infinite sustain, but.
Dessert item box for as long as you have a subscription. So just click the link in the description or use my code 16 free.
Floor 24. Enough said.
Just by clicking the description or using my code. Thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring the video. The episode. One of the first games to ever be created, 1962 Space War, was fundamental in establishing what a controller was. When the game was first created by hackers at MIT on a computer, it was originally controlled with the physical switches on the side of the console, which was not a great solution because when a player hit the wrong switch, they would just reset the entire machine. To fix this and make something more playable, the team working on Space War actually pulled over two members of the Microsoft Model Railroad Company. So Alan Kotok and Brandon Saunders would bring spare parts from the train set they were building, assemble that into one of the first video game controllers. Now, it is important to note that Tennis for Two created a nearly identical control box for their game 4 years earlier, but not this evidence. So as you'll notice, the levers on the Space War controller meant for trains and games, and all of them. It wasn't until 1967 that Ralph Baer creating the first multi-directional joystick video game, if only prototype. He then forgot he did that, making Fox Odyssey in 1972, because they slapped a couple knobs on a toaster and called it easier to master use. The standard controller holded to basically anything. It's reported that at the height of its popularity, one in 5 homes in America had this joystick lying outside. Now, of course, there were still a bunch of wacky-looking doohickeys that made games for you, which were made by it. We all know that none of these would last long. Because in the 80s, the new console, made by a former Japanese toy company, would revolutionize the world. You know it, I know it, let's all say it together now, the Epoch Cassette Vision. But that's not the one you were thinking of? Okay, so the Cassette Vision is honestly not a very special console wallet. Its built-in controller sucked, actually. And I just wanted to highlight it because of these two buttons right here. Pretty much every home gaming system and arcade machine up until 1991 would have some variation of start, reset, clear, game select, player select, or power. None of these were standard. However, the Cassette Vision would prominently feature start and select, and being the highest selling console in Japan in the early 80s, it's easy to say it instead. Though shortly after the Cassette Vision got Japan, the US would go through this little thing called the video game crash of 1983. The bubble that supported all these crazy consoles burst, and the industry went from being worth $3 billion to just over $100 million. Companies like Epoch saw their sales hit brick wall, Magnavox left the industry entirely, and Atari got hit so hard they had to pull a Walter Blake and resurrect his product in the middle of the next and all of these goofy sci-fi engines calling themselves controllers went up in a puff of smoke. It takes some real focused innovation and graphics to come out of the smoke. Some might say, every other couple hold on for the rest of time. Had to start and select buttons on controller 1, volume slider, and controller. Most importantly, buttons labeled A.
Oh hey, these guys are back.
E in that order. Shut up! Just the same way that the gaming industry lost $3 billion in just a couple of years after all. The Famicom became a smash hit in Japan, and released in America as the NES. The industry gained $2 billion of those dollars back by 1980. So Nintendo making up over 70% of it. This one console basically saved gaming single-handedly. So, of course, competitors rushed in to copy. The Sega Master System, Mark III, ditched the Mark I's joystick for a Famicom game. The Atari 7800, which originally came with a control-line joystick they used for the 2600, be released in Europe in the Famicom. The PC Engine, the official console companion, came with a Famicom game. If there was anything you could be sure of about the 80s, it was that leg warmers were out of fashion, and the D-pad and 2 face buttons was the way for the old competitor. However, in October of 1988, Sega was going for a big radical. A third one. That's if the Genesis just got the C button. This gave Sega all the confidence of Peter Parker and Spider-Man here, because they quickly started accumulating about all the stuff the Genesis started. Oh, wait, they also switch up really pop platforms in early G's. The best played with just A and B. Street Fighter in 1997, best played with 6 It did arcade cabinets release, where you would just physically punch these oversized, pressure-sensitive buttons and do different attacks depending on how hard you hit. This version of the game only sold 1,000 units, compared to the 6-button layout, which became one of the highest-selling arcade machines.
Fire, huh?
I would really love to see someone win EVO with a punch-pad type arcade stick, though. Somebody make that happen. By 1990, game companies wanted to play games like Street Fighter, you needed more buttons. So Nintendo would answer this call with the Super Famicom. Same D-pad, same start and select, now 6 entire action buttons. A, B, X, Y, an easy to reach diamond pattern on front, and L and R on the back. Now, it should be obvious why the L and R buttons are called that, but X and Y are a little more tricky. After all, the Neo Geo, released 6 months earlier, involved Takashi Nishiyama, the guy who made Street Fighter, had its 4 buttons labeled A, B, C, D. When asked about the X and Y, Shigeru Miyamoto himself actually gave a surprisingly insightful answer, saying, "Don't worry about it. From here, the evolution of controllers gets a lot more shitty, because we have the skeleton to build on and a clearer idea of where games are headed." Sega, of course, would still try to mix things up and add even more face buttons to the Saturn, this time with 6, but even with A, B, C, X, Y, Z, the Saturn didn't see any sales outside of Japan. Because while Sega thought they were Nintendo's arch nemesis, Sony would come in the third act to show that they weren't even a sidekick. I think at this point everybody knows that the PlayStation started as a Nintendo product. Their collaboration with Sony to make a CD-based add-on to the Super Famicom that fell apart and got spun off into its own console. Which is why the controller on the PlayStation is just a Super Famicom controller with some grip slapped on. But it also sold 100 million units and did double the sales of the Super Famicom, so those grips were now a core feature of basically every controller for the rest of time. Something that Sony did come up with that nobody was replicated with is the symbols on their buttons. As the controller's designer, Ken Rota explains, we wanted something simple to remember, which is why we went with icons for symbols, and I came up with a triangle, circle, cross, square combination with the afro. I gave each symbol a meaning, color. Triangle refers to a viewpoint, I had to represent one's head or direction. Square refers to a piece of paper, I had to represent menus or documents and made it pink. The circle and cross represent yes or no decision making, and I made them red and blue respectively. And the circle and cross, meaning yes and no, makes a lot more sense when you look at the Batsu and Maru symbols in Japanese, which basically mean yes and no or correct and incorrect. They're often used for stuff like marking answers on a test, meaning the layout of the PlayStation in Japan is actually just identical to that of the Super Famicom. With yes on the right and on. What's interesting is that PlayStation decided to swap this layout for the West, making cross yes and circle no. Something that would become standard for the company, as the PS5 even changed the Japanese version of the console to match this Western layout, which makes 0 sense. And alongside the buttons and the grips, the PlayStation also added additional triggers to their controller. Because where Sega and Nintendo were tiptoeing into the 3D game space, PlayStation went all in very early. And these triggers were the start of them, as they were used to help with 3-directional movement by allowing you to stray for look up and down. Though the real switch into 3D came with Nintendo's response to the PlayStation, and the inclusion of analog. Taking the concept from flight controls, the N64's analog joystick gave you the ability to not only move in 8 directions instead of 4, but press it just part way for more controlled movement. The N64 also did a lot of other really weird shit, because alongside shaping itself so Aquaman could use it as a weapon, it moved B and A around so B was on top, then replaced X and Y with 4 C buttons, and removed select entirely. The controller's third leg also meant a third trigger, which Nintendo called the Z button. This would definitely suggest that Nintendo was taking notes from Sega, having a layout way closer to the Saturn, even down to the C and Z buttons and no select. Though the other more clear inspiration was the Virtual Boy of all things, because that controller also had grips and 2 D-pads for additional control. Now this is where we make that final jump to the modern layout we opened the video with, because when PlayStation figured out analog was the way to go midway through the PS1's lifecycle, they created the DualShock, which set the formula that every PlayStation controller would follow to this day. And the formula that basically every other controller would follow, as Sony's next system, the PS2, became the highest selling console of all time in 2000, doing about triple the sales of everything else on the market combined. I'd argue that the Super Famicom gamepad is still technically more influential, but the DualShock is a close second, because every modern controller is basically just riffing on it. 2 analog sticks, analog triggers, clickable L3 and R3 buttons. They even went overboard and made the face buttons pressure sensitive too, which has never been used well in a game ever, and I will die on that hill. Though, while Sony was making all the big obvious developments, what happened at Sega was arguably much more interesting. Because with the release of the N64 happening during the Saturn's lifetime, the team quickly tried to counter with an analog controller of their own. Specifically, the 3D pad that coincided with the release of Knights. It had all the basic features of the N64 controller in an equally strange circle layout, and though it didn't have full analog capabilities, you had to switch between using the D-pad or the stick, it did put the stick up above the D-pad, which might seem strangely familiar. Fast forward a couple years to 1999, and the Dreamcast would release with that old 3D pad at the core of its controller's design. It also had a slot to put in memory cartridges with screens on them, and for once in Sega's life removed buttons from their competitor's design, settling on a colorful ABXY layout that might also seem strangely familiar. The Dreamcast did not sell well though, and Sega was pretty much on the
Final
last
Fantasy Crystal Chronicles.
by Sony and the team actually looked to Microsoft of all places for help, hearing that they were developing console, Sega chairman Isao Okawa reportedly asked Bill Gates personally to add some form of cross-functionality between their systems. While the negotiations ended up falling apart and Sega's hardware branch went under, the Xbox would release a few years later with a suspiciously Dreamcast-shaped controller. Or really, it's not suspicious at all. The early prototype designs for the Xbox Duke straight up ripped off Sega, because, quote, apparently the designer's kids had a Dreamcast. And even if you had no idea there was a direct connection, I think you could pretty easily tell just by looking at the controllers that Microsoft was taking obvious inspiration. Most important inspirations being that colorful AVXY layout, the left analog stick above the keypad. And that's kind of it for the major history. PlayStation would continue innovating on the DualShock all the way up to PS5 with its DualSense controller. The original Xbox Duke was considered way too big for people's hands and got redesigned in Japan to be more ergonomic. Then after that, Microsoft also just iterated on the design up until the Xbox One X, Series X2, X-Men United, or console we're currently on. In 2013, the Ouya controller came out. And Nintendo, well, they just kept doing weird shit. The GameCube came out at a time when dual analog sticks weren't quite the norm yet, so it still had a weird C-stick on the right and only 3 triggers. And they also brought X and Y back, but moved them to orbit around the A button. The Wii also made huge changes, putting B on the back as a trigger and adding 1 and 2 as extra buttons. As weird as this controller had to be to accommodate motion controls, it was also accompanied by the Wii Classic controller, which later became the Pro Controller series, which are just DualShocks with Super Famicom buttons. Really, the only major thing to change for modern controllers in terms of button layouts was also the first thing that ever became standard, Start and Select. Because years after every console adopted these buttons into their controller, words themselves kinda stopped having meaning. Originally coming from arcade machines and early computers, they didn't have any direct use in modern games. You didn't actually have to press start to start the game or press select to select something. Even the Xbox's back button that they had since the Duke is kind of a holdover. So starting with the PS4, Sony decided to spice things up a little, changing the buttons to share and options, but also adding a clickable trackpad that gained all the functionality of the select button. The Xbox One and PS5 then just added weird hieroglyphs. I don't know what these are supposed to be, but they basically act as start and select alongside some third button usually meant for sharing things online. Because, hey, social media has existed for almost 2 decades now, might as well add a button for that. So now, in the year of our Lord 2024, we come back around to those 3 major controllers from 3 major competitors that are all incredibly similar in design, and as we found out, actually have complex interconnected histories. Nintendo's front face button still the same as the Super Famicom. PlayStation has Super Famicom, symbols to parallel it, and Xbox's face buttons can be traced all the way back to the Sega Saturn. All of these controllers have clickable dual analog sticks and triggers like the DualShock. They all have menu buttons like the Set Vision that they all changed into their own symbols after Start and Select style fashion. And starting with the PS3 and the Xbox 360, they even added little logo buttons to take you back to the home screen. So that's it, the complete explanation for the layout of modern video controllers. I think it all fits together quite nicely. You have a good idea where everything came from. This video was pretty quick and easy for me to make. Right at the end here, I only really have one small question that I still want to answer. Why the fuck did Nintendo label their buttons backwards? So if you've been paying really close attention to the video thus far, you might have noticed there's actually a couple of holes in our timeline. Several decisions made about controller designs that I haven't talked about. I left these until the end on purpose, because controller button layouts, as you might imagine, are an incredibly niche topic. These are arbitrary decisions made by designers several decades ago that they probably didn't think was that important. And many of these designers have sadly passed away, so very little is officially written on this. The only person who ever really explained their reasoning was Teiji Goto from PlayStation. That was just the symbols, not the layout. They never even talked about why they switched circle and cross for North America. The Nintendo design team never once wrote down why they picked A, B, X, and Y. And they certainly don't talk about why they put them backwards, or why no other company has ever done that. While the timeline of controller layouts we went through so far was fun and easy to make, These deeper mysteries are why I even looked into this topic in the first place, because they are mysteries. Why we have ABXY, or why it's different on every controller, these aren't questions that you can find conclusive answers for. After digging through hundreds of articles, reading dozens of books and interviews, possible answers to the question. What I found. And no fan. There was not. Typically.
It's Gunpei.
Hey, you Koi. Responsible for the Ultra Hand, NES Zapper, and Rob. But one of his arguably most influential creations was the Game & Watch in 1980. Koi took inspiration from Elseworlds time to make a gaming system in order to make a playable game. Nice, specific at the art Donkey Kong, he saw that a joystick wouldn't work. Down to just 4 buttons or ring plus shape. And with that, he invented it. Fast forward a couple years to 1982, and Nintendo was looking to consoles. The head of this new project, Master, had to come up with a controller design that would accommodate all of the games that would be playable. Nice. Other at the time were all over the place. On Uemer's design spec for the Famicom locked down what he wanted. A joystick, start button, pause button. Nintendo R&D Team Number 2, under Uemura, worked hard to find something. Assembling arcade joysticks, other consoles to mash together buttons and levers. Nothing was quite comfortable. If Prana, who was previously under Play, tested they were. Uemura and the team scoffed at the end. Prana wired a Game & Watch controller up, and the designer took a turn with the controller, they fell in love. And here's where the story leaves out. But nothing is written about the book that I got information from, I Am Error, is into extremely specific other facet of its creation. Author directly, or just never elaborated on that decision. So here's my theory. If you look at that original Donkey Kong Game & Watch, you can see that it only has one labeled action button, jump. It's placed pretty much exactly where the A button is. So two buttons, and the jump was already comfortable as is.
And now this sounds much more familiar. Where the hell does Battle 3 play?
Then as for the labels, the entire Game & Watch lineup had Game A and Game B written on it, which was a holdover from even back in the 2600 era. Difficulty switches. So labeling the buttons with that probably just felt natural. And the label order just came down to A being primary and B being secondary. Or using the idea of decision buttons, A for accept, B for back. This is something that I think is backed up especially well by Nintendo changing the button layouts for the N64 and GameCube, making A much more obviously the primary action button. Though there is a common theory that they're labeled backwards because Japanese is traditionally written right to left, but that's only traditional Japanese. Modern Japanese is written left to right, and also so is English, which is what the controllers are labeled with. So that's why the Famicom looks like that, but what about all the other controllers? Looking into pretty much every console ever made, I found out that basically none of them labeled DNA backwards like this. The consoles that used Famicom gamepads, like the Sega Master System, Atari 7800, PC Engine, did use 2 buttons, and the PC Engine even had them labeled right to left, but they used 1 and 2 instead. And of course, the most important change was the Genesis switching to ABC left to right. My initial theory for this was that it had something to do with copyright, that Nintendo somehow patented or trademarked these labels, but looking into it further, while Nintendo does have patents for their exact controller technology, like the specific type of D-pad Koi invented, the labels on the buttons aren't mentioned, and that seems like something too broad to trademark anyways. Though, interestingly enough, the only controllers I could find that do have a backwards A and B are the Atari Jaguar and Links, which both have additional buttons that would have probably made them legally mistake. To me, it is likely that other controller designers, even if legally in the clear, probably wouldn't have wanted to mess with Nintendo anyways. But a much more probable reason is that they just didn't understand the backwards thing, or they wanted to be different. This applies to Sega especially. Noriyuki Sato created the Mark I console as Sega's first entry into space. On the same day as the Famicom, which massively outsold. I would imagine it would be very hard not to hold a grudge after having that happen, so Sato, who supervised the same R&D teams for the Mark II Genesis, would very easily have just wanted to avoid labeling their buttons the same way as Nintendo, even after taking the Famicom's general controller design for the systems. However, a big piece of the puzzle comes from product designer Mitsushige Shiraiwa. Because while Sato overlooked R&D altogether, and the team lead Masami Ishikawa actually created the internals, Shiraiwa created the case of the Genesis and its controller before anything else was done. They say that Sega mainly wanted a controller meant for a worldwide audience, specifically something easy to use for both the small hands of Japanese children and the hands of Western adults. Which to me says that it is very likely Sega made the letters alphabetical to cater to a Western audience, something backed up by the fact that in 1993, just 10 years after getting the butt kicked by the Famicom, Sega actually took 55% console market share in America, mostly because of their focus on that market with games like Sonic the Hedgehog and their uncensored release of Mortal Kombat. This is pretty hard to look into, though, because some of the only information about Shiraiwa you can find online is an article from a Brazilian toy blog that's somehow referenced by Wikipedia, and an exclusive interview locked behind a Kickstarter coffee table book from 2013 with no physical or digital copies of it. So, this is what I've spent the last month or so of my life working on. The Super Famicom is where things get a little bit weirder, too. Because the decision to label the extra face buttons X and Y feels way more random than A and B. I did find a couple prototypes for the controller floating around that even labeled the buttons A, B, C, D, E, and F. So if this is to be believed, at one point the buttons were alphabetical, at least internally. Changing E and F into L and R is still obvious to me, that's way more intuitive, but of course, nothing is written about X and Y. So my main theory is a combination of a couple of things. One, the Neo Geo did come out earlier with an ABCD label, which combined with the Genesis may have forced a decision to change the letters. Two, C and D would be easier to mix up with A and B, especially for people who English. And three, X and Y, just like A and B, are very common pairs of letters in mathematics and programming, which Nintendo engineers would have probably been familiar with. So all of this could have easily led to Uemura and his team, who designed the Super Famicom, to pick the ABXY layout that we all know today. This specific diamond pattern, though, as influential as it is, might have been a bit of a mistake, or at least the specific order is. Because while that earlier prototype design had A on the bottom and B on the left, the final controller put A on the right and B on the bottom. This still makes logical sense. The controller follows the backwards convention of the Famicom to be familiar, but A was no longer the most comfortable button. In fact, in Super Mario World and quite a few other games, the B button was now jump and confirm, A relegated to a secondary spin jump. And if you remember back to like 60 seconds ago, the Genesis had majority market share in America by the early 90s, with its confirm button being A on the bottom left. So what this all leads to is our next big undocumented decision: PlayStation swapping what Cross and Circle do in North America. I have read so many people saying that the buttons were swapped because people in the US thought Cross meant yes and Circle meant no, but I'm gonna be honest with you, I have no idea in what world anyone would think that. X is clearly notable if we're just going by symbols, and tons of North American PlayStation games actually used triangle as the method. Even up to Vice City on the PS2, so the Circle button wasn't even consistently back until years later. The real, far more likely story to me is that people in the US were just way more comfortable with the bottom button being confirmed, because of the popularity of the Genesis and Super Mario. Circle and Triangle then sort of fought over the back button up until the Dreamcast and Xbox came out and made that understandable. But all of this was pretty much decided entirely.
So much of my damages.
As Kojima famously said fuck it and made Circle confirm on the US release of Metal Gear Solid. While it does help that Batsu and Mario don't
Up to
mean
Tails,
anything to
right? I
Americans,
kinda don't
I
like
don't think
it.
Sony actually cared that much about the symbols. I mean, they changed the layout in Japan, where the buttons do actually mean something. So it's pretty clear to me that comfort and
Aphilid,
conformity were
Veil,
much
and
higher
Iya
priorities.
just don't do enough
And that's
damage.
actually the common
This
thread for
team is
all of
very
these decisions
gimmicky.
about buttons and layouts, because they are very arbitrary. However much thought went into them obviously wasn't enough to really talk about or write down.
Well, I mean, it works. Iya instant kills and does status ailments. Aphilid summons, does more shenanigans.
Just puts the A and B backwards. That's just how it is. But after obsessing over these buttons for hours and hours, I can't help but find it interesting how even a simple thing like button layouts can really reflect the mindset made it. Gunpei Yokoi and Masayuki Uemura famously followed a design philosophy that propelled Nintendo to success by creating hardware meant to be just as fun as the games that use it. Yokoi specifically had an adage of lateral thinking with open technology that he later went on to use to create the Game Boy. The Nintendo R&D teams clearly didn't care about the technical side of things if it meant making something easy and intuitive instead, even if it meant putting the A and B buttons backwards. Meanwhile, Hideki Sato at Sega was always trying to one-up Nintendo at every turn, trying to create hardware that was more powerful or had more features, even if it wasn't more intuitive. Nothing really says that more to me than the Genesis controller, clearly trying to look like it had more face buttons than the Famicom, even though in reality it had the exact same number of buttons because there was no select. The alphabetical layout of these buttons not only follows that competitive spirit, but showcases Sega's clear focus on the American market that accounted for a lot of their success. I haven't talked about it nearly enough, but these two companies having this big split in the way they design their controllers really is the pivotal moment in the history of button layouts, because they would go on to influence every other console manufacturer that came afterwards. Teo Goto at PlayStation, for example, took obvious hints from Nintendo. They straight up say that PlayStation was trying to get people to upgrade from the Super Famicom, so they mirrored its controller and upgraded it with better buttons, better ergonomics, and cleaner shapes. They even followed it so closely they had to backpedal the cross and circle buttons because the layout wasn't comfortable in North America. Meanwhile, Xbox clearly took all their
Anyway,
ideas from Sega.
I'm done now.
I don't
I'm
think
gonna
I
go
can
do
be
some
more clear
writing.
about that. They wanted the American market
Game
share, so they worked with a
code
company that captured it.
writing.
And they were going head-to-head with PlayStation just the same way that Sega went up against Nintendo. The original Xbox Duke even redesigned itself to be smaller in Japan, exactly like the Sega Saturn did with its controller years earlier. So it's very funny to me that despite saying no to cross-platform support, Microsoft arguably just carried the Dreamcast legacy to